The first thing she noticed was the cold. It clung to her skin like damp cloth, seeping through the thin sweater she didn't remember putting on. When Tessa opened her eyes, the world arrived in fragments. A ceiling of rough-hewn board stained the color of smoke, a window set crooked in its frame, glass filmed with grime, a nail jutting from a beam like a rusted tooth. Her head throbbed in a slow, tidal pulse. The floor under her shoulder felt splintered and gritty, as if someone had swept sawdust into the cracks and left it there for years. She rolled onto her back, and the room tilted. A sour, mold-slick smell rose from the warped planks, braided with old wood smoke and something metallic she couldn't place. Each breath tasted like a cellar after rain. She pressed her palm to her forehead and found a tender ridge above her left temple. No blood, just the ache, heavy and deliberate, as if her skull had been packed with wet sand. Where am I? The question formed before memory followed. She pushed up onto an elbow. A cabin, single room, low roof, the kind men build to be temporary and then forget. In the corner, a cast-iron stove squatted on bricks, its door cracked open to reveal ash as soft as gray flour. A chair with one missing rung leaned toward a square table gouged with knife marks and burn rings. Someone had nailed 2 boards across a second doorway, the wood fresh against the older walls. Wind threaded the gaps and sang a thin, impatient whistle. Light slipped through a seam in the crooked window and landed in a pale bar across the floor. Dust turned in it, lazy and relentless. Outside, something scraped against the siding, branches or claws. She listened for traffic and heard only the living quiet of deep woods. Wind moving tree to tree, the far-off bark of a dog that didn't sound friendly, a crow's bleak conversation. No road noise, no human voices, no phones chiming or cars passing or neighbors slamming doors. Her heartbeat began to count time for her, too loud in the hush. She patted herself in quick, embarrassed motions, as if she were late for something and couldn't find her keys. Jeans, sweater, no jacket, no socks, bare feet blackened with dirt and a film of cold. No phone in her back pocket, no crossbody bag biting into her shoulder, no watch on her wrist. She rubbed the faint circle of skin where the watch should have been, then checked again. Nothing. The emptiness of it made her throat go dry. Fragments surfaced, slippery. Portland. The bar on the water with the strings of lights and the salt in the air and a laugh she knew Jason's and a glass that tasted like citrus and something sweeter. The way his hand covered hers and his eyes went soft when he said, "Easy, I've got you." Then the lights inside her body dimmed, like a room where someone finds the switch and slides it down. After that, a knot of dark. She tried the window first. The frame wobbled in its swollen track, but stuck, the paint fused by weather and neglect. When she dug her nails beneath the sill, splinters teased her fingertips. The cold coming through the seam wasn't the kind that would let her last long outside without shoes, but the thought of a door, an actual exit that opened, drew her like a heat source. She crossed the floor slowly, testing the boards with her weight. The cabin complained softly, old wood talking to old nails. The door was plank on plank, a rough latch in place where a knob might have been long ago. She lifted the latch and pulled. The door shifted an inch, then halted and thudded back with a muffled jolt that traveled up her arms. She pushed her shoulder into it and felt the dull refusal of something on the other side. Bar, chain, or simply a new lock sunk into an old frame. She set her feet and pulled harder, breath fogging the air, arms burning. The door gave nothing. She let the latch fall and stepped back, breath sharp in her chest. Panic did not shout. It arrived as a precise rearrangement of sensation, as if a lens had been snapped into place and everything sharpened at once. The grain of the wood, the moth wing caught in a spider web above the stove, the rhythmic tap of the loose board in the window frame. She looked again for anything she could use. The chair, too light. The table, heavy but bolted to the floor with 2 bent railroad spikes. The stove poker near the hearth, its handle red with rust. She wrapped her fingers around it. The metal stung her palm with cold and left a fine orange powder on her skin. "Think," she whispered, surprising herself with the sound of her voice. It came out hoarse, a stranger's voice in a room she did not own. She pictured Lucille's kitchen, the clean white tile, the calm order of cups, the morning light, and then Jason's mouth shaping a lie she had believed until it wasn't one. The thought jittered in her bones and made her knees feel unreliable. She went to the window again. From up close, she could see where rain had chewed at the putty, where the glass no longer met the wood as it should. The lower left corner had a hairline crack. If she could pry the putty out, she might ease the pain free. She slid the poker's tip between the frame and the glass and levered gently. The wood groaned. The crack in the glass lengthened with a tiny, brittle sigh. She stopped, teeth clenched, listening for footsteps. Nothing. Only wind and the long-breathing hush of trees. Her bare toes curled against the cold floor. She pressed again, slower. The putty flecked away. A sliver of glass loosened and nicked the pad of her thumb. The sting was immediate, bright. A bead of blood welled, and she sucked it away, tasting iron over mold. She kept working, inch by inch, until a wedge of air opened and the cold came in cleaner, smelling of pine and wet leaves. Outside, the light had shifted, the kind of thin, colorless brightness that belongs to late morning in overcast country. Time had moved without her. A sudden sound cracked the quiet. A dog, closer now, barking with the authority of an animal that knows its borders. It was answered by another, lower voice, the fence-line kind of bark. She froze, one hand on the frame, the other holding the poker like a clumsy tool. The barking cut off mid-syllable, replaced by the irregular crunch of footsteps on damp ground. Not wind, not branches, boots. They came from the right, scuffing through leaves, then paused. She let the poker down, slow, until it touched the floor without a sound. Her breath went small. Through the dirty glass, she saw a shape ghost past the corner of the window. A sleeve in dark canvas, the pale flash of a hand. Someone muttered, one word, maybe two, too blurred by the wall to catch. Her heart chose a faster rhythm. She stepped back from the window, counting backward from 5 the way she had learned to quiet herself before exams, before interviews, before any moment when nerves tried to bloom into chaos. 4, 3. The footsteps moved again, closer to the door, then away, then back, as if the person were pacing the short stretch of packed ground that served as a yard. She considered the table, the chair, how to wedge the chair under the latch, how to brace the table against the door if they tried to force it. Her mind kept sliding back to absence. The phone that wasn't in her pocket, the watch that wasn't on her wrist, the bag that wasn't on the table where she must have put it down to take off her shoes. Shoes she didn't have anymore. Without those objects, she felt unguided, stripped of the little anchors that kept ordinary life in place. The footsteps stopped. Silence gathered again, as if the trees leaned closer to hear. Then a voice, male, came clear through the thin wall, flat, matter of fact, not raised to be cruel and therefore worse. She'll sleep till dusk. The voice outside didn't fade. It drifted past the window again, then closer to the wall. Tessa froze, one hand still on the splintered frame. Her heartbeat felt misplaced, up near her throat instead of behind her ribs. Another voice answered, lower, older, and calm. Jason said no one's to come near her till he calls. Her skin tightened. Jason. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples reaching every part of her. She edged nearer to the window, crouching so her eyes met the narrow seam between 2 boards. Through the dirt-smeared glass, she saw outlines, 2 men, jackets dark with rain, one smoking, the other kicking at the ground with a boot heel. Their truck, a dented blue Ford, was parked beyond the treeline. The smoker laughed, the sound sharp. He's sure she told the old lady where the thing is? Yeah, the other replied. That platinum plate, some award or whatever. He said it's worth a fortune if you know where to sell it. She keeps it in the house on the piano. The world narrowed to the breath in her chest. Aunt Lucille. The plate, silver white, heavy as history, was Lucille's one treasure, a lifetime ago, gifted after her final performance in New York. Tessa had dusted it as a child, knowing only that it shimmered when the light hit it right. The smoker exhaled toward the trees. You think the old woman's gonna fight back? Nah, the second man said, spitting. She's what, 70? Won't resist much. He said to go easy if she does, but you know how it goes. The sound of their laughter folded into the rustle of wind. Tessa's mind refused the words even as she understood them. Jason, her Jason, had sent these men. He had sent her here. The memory of his face, calm, amused, affectionate, flashed through her like a photograph, catching fire. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth. Her breath shook against her fingers. It made no sense. He had kissed her forehead before that drink, called her sweetheart, said they'd drive north for the weekend, a cabin getaway. She'd believed him because love had already rewritten her logic. Outside, one of the men circled toward the truck. He'll text when it's time. Wants us to hit the house around sunset. Tonight. Yeah, by then the girl'll be out cold. Said he dosed her enough for 12 hours. Dosed. The word scraped something raw inside her. The drink. The sweetness that had numbed her tongue. The smoker flicked ash into the mud. Crazy bastard. Risky pulling his girlfriend into this. He said she's not his girlfriend anymore, the other answered. Said she's stupid enough to keep her aunt's keys in her purse. Tessa's knees gave a little. She caught the edge of the table, steadying herself. A wave of nausea rose from somewhere deep, heavy as sea swell. They were going to her aunt's house. They were going to hurt Lucille. She crawled back toward the stove, where the shadows held her like a shroud. The cabin seemed smaller now, air thick with the odor of rot and smoke. Through the boards, the men kept talking mundane, practical details, like grocery clerks listing produce. Lock the door again before you go, one said. We'll be back around 7. She'll still be out. Their boots scraped, then receded. A door slammed. The truck engine coughed, grumbled, and pulled away down the unseen road. Silence followed, vast and unreal. Tessa stayed crouched for a long moment, the silence pressing against her eardrums until it hurt. When she finally moved, the movement felt borrowed. Her body didn't seem to belong to her. Jason. She mouthed the name, no sound attached. It was as if she were trying to pronounce a foreign word that refused to form properly. She saw again the way he had leaned toward her across the bar table, eyes soft under the amber light. You trust me, right? He'd said, and she'd nodded before he even finished. Now that memory had the shape of a knife, she pressed her palms flat to the floor. The wood was cold, splintered, unyielding. She thought of Lucille's hands, thin, elegant, always warm. Her aunt had held those hands against Tessa's cheeks once and said, "Someday you'll learn that love isn't supposed to make you smaller." Tessa wished she'd listened. A faint ticking came from the wall, probably an insect behind the boards, but in her mind it sounded like a countdown. Dusk. They'd said dusk. If she waited here, Jason would come back. He would take what he wanted, and her aunt might not live through the night. She rose, the blood moving slow in her legs. Her fingers found the stove poker she'd used earlier. The metal had grown colder, almost alive with chill. She tested the window again. The crack she'd started had spread, spiderwebbing outward in thin white lines. She pushed at the loose corner until another fragment snapped free, slicing across her palm. The sting flared, followed by warmth as blood welled and ran down her wrist. She didn't stop. The air that came through the opening smelled of wet pine and earth. The forest waited, vast, silent, indifferent. She thought of the distance to Portland, of how far she might have been driven while unconscious. Maybe 50 miles, maybe more. It didn't matter. She would find a way out. Her pulse steadied into something colder than fear, an awareness that moved through her muscles like instruction. She tore a strip from her sweater, wrapped it around the cut, and pulled until the fabric darkened. The pain sharpened her focus. She stood at the window, measuring. The frame would hold long enough to cut herself free. Beyond the trees, light was already beginning to thin, the sky going colorless. The day was shrinking. Time was shrinking with it. Her mouth was dry when she whispered, "I have to get out." The words barely left her throat, but they steadied her anyway. She braced the poker against the frame, leaned her weight into it, and pressed until the glass gave with a small, surrendering crack that sounded, at least to her, like the first real heartbeat she'd heard since waking up. The sound of the truck faded until it became part of the wind. For a long while after, Tessa stood listening, waiting for the noise to return, half convinced it would. When nothing did, she turned toward the window. The glass was cracked and loose, her blood drying dark on the pane. There was no plan, only instinct to get out. She wedged the stove poker into the frame again. The wood groaned, a seam split, and the glass surrendered with a shiver that scattered splinters onto the floor. Cold air poured in, tasting of pine and rain. She swept the shards aside with her sleeve, hoisted herself onto the sill, and pushed through. The frame bit her hip, the nails catching fabric, but then she was outside, half falling, half landing on damp earth. The ground struck her knees, and the breath left her lungs. She crouched, palms pressed into the mud, heart pounding too loud for the silence she was entering. The cabin looked smaller from out here, leaning into the trees like it had been abandoned decades ago. No lights, no voices, only the groan of wood in the wind. Tessa forced herself to stand. Her bare feet sank into the cold ground. The first step tore skin from her heel. The second hurt less because the first pain had already taught her what to expect. She stumbled toward the treeline, following no path, just distance from the door that had held her and the men who might return. Branches clawed her arms. Her sweater snagged on a thorn and ripped with a sound that felt too loud, like the forest would hear and object. She pulled free and kept moving, slower now, trying to quiet the noise she made. The air smelled of wet bark and something faintly animal. She didn't look back until the cabin vanished behind her. Then she let herself breathe. The forest wasn't thick, but it was endless. Pines standing close, their trunks dark with rain. Patches of moss glowed dimly in the gray light. Each step was a negotiation between pain and balance. Pebbles pressed against raw skin, leaves slick underfoot. Somewhere far off, a bird called, the sound both alive and lonely. She didn't know where the road was. She didn't even know if there was one. They could have driven her north, west, anywhere past the city limits. The thought made her chest tighten, but standing still wasn't an option. A branch cracked behind her. She froze. Silence. Then another sound, a bark, sharp and impatient. A dog. Tessa's pulse stumbled. She scanned the trees and saw nothing, but the bark came again, closer this time, followed by the metallic rattle of a chain. She dropped to her knees, crawled behind a fallen log slick with lichen, and pressed her back to it. The forest went still again, except for the small, rhythmic panting she realized was her own. She waited. The barking faded, then stopped. Water dripped from somewhere high above, tapping the leaves like a metronome. She counted the beats until her breathing matched them. When she moved again, she moved low and fast, careful where her feet fell. The woods thickened ahead. Between the trunks, she saw the shape of another structure. A shed, maybe, or an old animal pen. She hesitated, then went toward it. Shelter meant risk, but also a chance to find something useful. The building was smaller than the cabin, its roof sagging under wet leaves. The door hung crooked. Inside, the smell hit her first: mold, rust, the sharp ammonia of animal waste long dried. In the dim light that filtered through the slats, she saw tools, a broken crate, and near the wall, something that made her stop. A pair of boots. They were heavy, brown once, now gray with dust and spider silk. She almost laughed from relief. She dropped to her knees, pulled one toward her and shook it out. A dead leaf fell. The other boot resisted, stiff from age. She reached in to loosen it and felt something move. Tessa jerked her hand back. A small, wet squeal came from inside, followed by the dart of movement, fast gray gone. A mouse or a rat. Her throat tightened. She wanted to fling the boots away, to scrub the idea of it from her skin. But her feet ached, the soles bleeding. Survival, not comfort. She picked up the first boot again, shook it hard until she was sure it was empty, then shoved her foot in. It was too big, the leather stiff, but it fit well enough to stand. The second followed, just as cold. The moment she straightened, she heard the dog again, closer. No time. She stepped outside, the ground muffling under the weight of her borrowed boots. The forest looked darker now, the clouds thickening. The wind brought a smell of rain. She ran. Branches whipped her face. Water flew from leaves, hitting her eyes. She tripped once, caught herself, kept going. Every sound felt amplified. The thud of her feet, the rasp of breath, the distant bark that refused to fade. After a while, the dog's voice grew fainter, replaced by the steady hum of the forest settling back into itself. Tessa slowed, clutching a tree for balance. Her lungs burned. The boots were heavy, her feet slippery with blood inside them. She leaned her forehead against the bark and listened to the pulse in her ears. Somewhere behind her, the last echo of barking broke apart into nothing. She could no longer tell where it had come from. Only the wind remained. She straightened, wiped rain from her face, and looked around. The trees blurred into mist, the kind that thickened as the day began to die. The light was already dimming, that gray hour before dusk when every shadow could be a person. She didn't stop to wonder how far she'd gone. She didn't dare. She moved again, one foot after the other, breath shallow, hands scraped raw. Every step away from the cabin felt like a promise, every breath a test of will. The mist rose higher, swallowing the lower trunks of the trees, softening the world until only her movement proved she was still part of it. By the time the first drop of rain hit her face, she was no longer sure which direction was forward. But she kept walking, boots heavy, heart louder than the storm building above her, vanishing into the forest's pale breath, a flicker of motion swallowed by the gray. The rain came first as a whisper, thin threads falling between the trees. Then it thickened, drawing veils across the forest until the world turned to gray water and sound. Each drop carried cold deeper into Tessa's skin. The wind pressed the rain sideways, filling the space between trunks, turning the pathless ground into a network of mud veins. Her boots sank half an inch with every step. The leather had already soaked through. Each movement released a small squelch that seemed to echo. She didn't know how long she'd been walking. Minutes, maybe hours. Time had dissolved into the rhythm of foot, breath, heartbeat, rain. Every now and then she stopped, certain she heard a new sound, an engine, a voice, but it was only the forest talking to itself. The rain had its own language, and she couldn't tell when it began to imitate human things. She lifted her face, blinked against the water, and saw nothing resembling direction. The trees all looked the same, tall, black, stripped of meaning. Her breath came out in small clouds that vanished immediately, as if the air refused to remember her. Her thoughts drifted to dry places because her body needed them. She saw her apartment again, the soft yellow light, the stack of unpaid bills she'd been meaning to handle, the plant by the window that Lucille had given her last Christmas. Something that needs attention, her aunt had said. So you remember to slow down. Tessa had laughed. You mean something to make me feel guilty every time I forget to water it. Lucille's smile had been fond and tired. That's what family's for. Now, in the rain, the memory cut deep. She kept walking, wiping her face with her sleeve, though it was useless. The rain blurred everything into streaks. Trunks, moss, even her own arms. It was as if the world refused edges. Jason's face intruded next. Not the stranger from the cabin's whispered conspiracy, but the man she'd fallen for. The one who had stayed up late fixing her laptop, who brought her black coffee even though he preferred it drowned in cream, who'd said, "You and I, we don't need anyone else." She'd believed it. The memory now felt like poison disguised as sugar. She pushed it away, but the past was relentless. It began to play scenes uninvited, clear as glass. The last argument with Lucille, the way the afternoon light had cut across the kitchen tiles. Lucille had stood at the sink, hands still wet from washing fruit. "You don't know him, Tessa. He asks questions that have nothing to do with you. About the house, about the things I keep here. That's not love." Tessa had been leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, defensive. "You think everyone's after something." "And you think no one is," Lucille had replied softly. "That's how people like him find people like you." That had been the trigger, sharp and unfair. Tessa had stepped forward, voice rising. "You're not my mother!" The words had come out louder than she'd meant, snapping the air. Lucille had flinched, not from volume, but from heartbreak. She dried her hand slowly, turned off the faucet, and said nothing else. The silence that followed had been the longest they'd ever shared. Tessa remembered walking out, slamming the door, her chest full of victory that turned sour before she reached the end of the driveway. She'd driven to Jason's apartment that night, needing someone to make her feel right. And he had too easily. Now, trudging through the storm, that memory crawled under her skin. Regret didn't need warmth to burn. "I'm sorry," she murmured, though there was no one to hear. Her voice vanished into the rain. The mud deepened. Her boots grew heavier, every step pulling against suction. Once, she slipped, catching herself on a root, but the jolt sent pain lancing through her arm. The forest floor tilted down, water running between ridges like veins of silver. She followed one, thinking it might lead somewhere, anywhere. Her legs began to shake. Hunger found her next, an empty ache below her ribs that made her lightheaded. She hadn't eaten since when? The bar. That drink. After that darkness. She stopped beneath a tree with a hollow trunk and pressed her forehead to the bark. The world smelled of rain and rot. Her thoughts blurred into one another, forming half prayers, half memories. Lucille's voice again, from years ago this time. "When you're lost, don't run. Just breathe. The forest can't swallow what stays still." But standing still meant freezing. Standing still meant waiting for the men to find her, for Jason to send more. A rumble rolled across the distance. Not thunder yet, just warning. The sky was dimming into that deep bruised blue that comes before night. If she didn't find shelter soon, the cold would become something else. She pushed away from the tree and kept going. Her feet slipped twice more. The third time she went down hard, knees striking rock beneath the mud. Pain flared up her thigh and into her hip. She groaned, biting her lip, tasting metal again. For a moment she stayed there, breathing through it, letting the rain beat against her back. The world swayed. Her eyes wanted to close. She shook her head hard, forced them open. "Not yet," she whispered. The thought of Lucille's house, warm kitchen, the plate on the piano, the woman who had raised her when no one else would, became the rope she clung to. She imagined Lucille waiting by the window, hair pinned back, humming absent-mindedly as she brewed tea. That image kept Tessa moving even when her body no longer wanted to. Her breathing turned ragged. The trees blurred again, not from rain, but from tears she didn't notice until they mixed with the water on her face. The sound of her heartbeat grew heavy, each thump echoing inside her ears. She took another step, then another. Her balance wavered. The forest tilted. She tried to think of something solid, something real, a street name, a landmark, but the rain erased everything. The edges of her vision darkened. Her legs buckled. The mud caught her like cold hands. She hit the ground sideways, too tired to curse. The smell of earth filled her nose, wet and ancient. For a moment she lay still, rain beating on her cheek, her hair plastered to her face. The sound of it was endless, 1,000 soft impacts merging into one low hum. She heard her heartbeat then, slow, uneven, like something trying to remember a rhythm it once knew. Her last thought before the dark pressed in was of Lucille's hands on her shoulders, gentle but firm, saying, "Find your way home, Tessa." Then the world dissolved into rain and heartbeat and nothing else. When the rain softened into a mist, memory came to fill the silence it left behind. It didn't arrive gently. It poured through Tessa's mind like floodwater breaching a dam, dragging the past out of the dark corners where she'd tried to bury it. She saw her mother first, Evelyn, smiling from behind a camera's flash, lips painted the color of cherries, skin glowing with the kind of beauty that always made people stop mid-sentence. Evelyn Morgan had been the kind of woman who believed the world owed her attention, and for a while it did. She was young, reckless, and dazzling, a model whose face had graced perfume ads and department store posters from Portland to New York. But beauty was a currency that depreciated fast, and Evelyn spent hers carelessly. When the job slowed, she chased men who promised her a softer landing. The last one promised Paris, and instead left her with a baby and a hospital bill she couldn't pay. Lucille, her older sister, was the one who came to the rescue. She had been studying opera in Boston, already earning small roles, her voice praised for its rare warmth. But when the hospital called, when she saw the infant Evelyn couldn't even look at without trembling, she didn't hesitate. She signed the forms, moved back to Maine, and took the baby home. Tessa had grown up on the echo of that decision. She remembered the sound of Lucille's voice before she remembered her own reflection. Soft, round vowels filling the small house in the evenings as her aunt rehearsed. Even lullabies sounded like arias. Lucille's love wasn't dramatic. It was consistent, quiet, folded into everyday things. The extra blanket tucked around Tessa's feet, the smell of cinnamon bread on Sunday mornings, the steady rhythm of a woman who built her life around someone else's child. But love that constant can feel invisible to a girl desperate to be seen. By the time Tessa turned 16, her world had shrunk to the narrow streets of Portland's East End and the small circle of friends who measured worth by how far they could throw themselves beyond it. She'd wanted more than the quiet house, more than the discipline of a guardian who asked where she was going, who she'd be with, what time she'd be home. Lucille would wait up for her every night anyway, book in hand, eyes tired but patient. "Did you eat?" she'd ask. "Yeah," Tessa would mutter, stepping past her. Then, "Good night, love." Sometimes Tessa answered. Sometimes she didn't. In school, she was bright but distracted. Her art teachers said she had talent. She could sketch faces that felt alive, but she didn't know what to do with it. When a college recruiter asked what she wanted, she said, "Out." That was enough of an answer then. Her mother's ghost hovered at the edges of everything. Evelyn died when Tessa was 8, a car crash on the coast road after a party. Tessa didn't remember the funeral, only Lucille's face afterward, composed, blank in a way that meant she was holding too much inside. After that, the house became a shrine of small silences. Lucille rarely spoke of her sister, but every so often she'd look at Tessa with that soft, worried sadness, as if trying to rewrite an old mistake. It was around that time that Tessa learned the power of being noticed. She wasn't beautiful like her mother, not exactly, but she had the same restless spark, the same way of catching eyes in a room. At 20, that attention felt like salvation. And then came Jason. He wasn't from Portland. He drifted into town claiming he worked in real estate, though no one had ever seen him in an office. What he had was charm, polished and practiced, the kind that made waitresses forget to charge him for drinks and made Tessa forget how to think clearly. He met her at an art gallery opening she'd wandered into by accident, wearing a thrift store dress she'd bought because it looked like something her mother might have worn. Jason had looked at her that night like she was the only real thing in the room. "You see everything," he'd said, studying her sketchbook when she showed him a few drawings. "But you hide half of it. That's why your work feels alive. It's fighting itself." No one had ever said something like that to her before. She'd felt exposed and adored at once. He began to fill the gaps Lucille's quiet love could never reach. With Jason, everything had urgency. He brought her to new places, the coast at midnight, the rooftops overlooking the city lights. He told stories about leaving behind people who didn't understand ambition, who wanted him to settle. She saw herself in those words. Lucille didn't. At first, she'd stayed polite, invited Jason for dinner, asked questions that were all concern disguised as conversation. He answered them smoothly, smiling with that easy confidence that could charm anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Lucille was hard to fool. After he left, she'd turn to Tessa, voice low. "He's clever, but clever men who need admiration are dangerous." Tessa had rolled her eyes. "You don't know him." "I don't have to," Lucille had said simply. "I know the type." The words stung because they came from the woman who had never once insulted anyone. Lucille didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, she observed. That quiet scrutiny felt unbearable. The more Lucille warned, the deeper Tessa sank into Jason's orbit. It became a pattern. Lucille's worry, Tessa's defiance, Jason's soothing presence afterward. He told her she was brave for standing up for herself. He said Lucille didn't understand independence. He said, "You've spent your whole life being someone's responsibility. Don't you want to be your own?" He was good at making rebellion sound like freedom. By the time he started asking about Lucille's things, the old photographs, the awards, the stories from her career, Tessa was too in love to see the curiosity for what it was. She told him everything he wanted to know. About the silver piano, about the keepsake box that held letters from famous names, about the platinum plate Lucille had been awarded before she quit performing. She thought it was intimacy, sharing secrets about the woman who'd raised her. She didn't realize she was handing him a map. The argument came on a humid evening in late July. Lucille had just finished teaching a local choir class. She looked tired but resolute, the way she always did when she'd made up her mind about something. "I don't want him here anymore," she'd said. "He's using you, Tessa." Tessa's temper had sparked immediately. "Because he isn't from your little circle? Because he doesn't worship your opera stories?" Lucille's expression had softened, which somehow made it worse. "Because I've seen this before. He's not who you think he is." Those words landed like a slap, not for what they said, but because they threatened the fragile dream Tessa had built. She'd stood up, fists clenched. "You're wrong about him. You always think you're right, but you're wrong this time." Lucille had sighed, the kind of sound that wasn't defeat, but heartbreak. "I hope so." But Tessa didn't want hope. She wanted certainty. She wanted to believe in the world Jason had promised her, the one beyond rules, beyond caution, beyond the quiet house that had kept her safe but restless. She'd packed a small bag that night, ignoring Lucille's pleas at the doorway. Rain had been falling then, too, soft and unremarkable, the kind of weather that erases footprints. Jason's car headlights had cut through it, bright and waiting. He'd smiled when she climbed in, touched her hand, said, "You did the right thing." She'd looked back once through the window. Lucille stood on the porch in her robe, hair wet from the rain, one hand raised in a gesture that wasn't quite goodbye. Tessa turned away before guilt could take shape. That was the last night she'd seen her aunt before everything began to unravel. They left the apartment just after sunset, when the sky over Portland had turned the color of bruised plums. Jason said he knew a place on the water, quiet, no tourists, the kind of bar where the bartender remembered your name. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting easy on Tessa's knee, the gesture gentle enough to pass as comfort. Streetlights slid over the windshield in thin, broken bands. The smell of the bay came in through a cracked window, salt and diesel and low tide. The bar was wedged between a bait shop and a shuttered boathouse, its sign a weathered plank with a gull painted in flaking white. Inside, everything was close and dark, knotty pine walls, a ceiling fan clicking a steady beat, a jukebox that looked like it had been retired since the first Bush administration, a few men in rain jackets hunched over their beers. The river beyond the back windows moved in long, metallic sheets. Jason steered her toward a corner table. "Told you," he said, smiling. "Local secret." The bartender, gray ponytail, Red Sox cap, gave Jason a nod like they'd met once and decided it was enough. "What are you having?" "2 house specials," Jason said before Tessa could speak. "Make hers with the good stuff." The man smirked. "There's only one kind of stuff." They sat. Jason reached across the table and covered Tessa's hand with his. "You doing okay? You looked tired earlier. Work beating you up again?" "I'm fine," she said. It was mostly true. She hadn't slept well the night before. Lucille's face kept appearing when she closed her eyes, tired, disappointed, that soft expression that made Tessa feel both loved and judged. She pushed the thought away. Jason squeezed her fingers. "You deserve better than stress and guilt. Trust me, okay? We're getting out of this city for a couple days. I found a place up north. Woods, a lake. No one to bother us." "Like a cabin?" she asked, half teasing, picturing quilts and board games and the uncomplicated comfort of being wanted. "Exactly." He leaned back as the bartender set down 2 wide rocks, glasses bristling with citrus. The liquid inside glowed a deep coral red, sleek as lacquer. "Special mix," Jason said. "You'll like it." She lifted the glass. The rim smelled like orange peel and something floral. The first sip was summer, sweet, bright, a little bitter at the end. "What is it?" "Trade secret," Jason said. "Finest in the house." He watched her over the rim of his own glass, eyes soft, mouth tilted in that almost smile he used when he wanted her to feel like he was sharing a joke only they understood. She smiled back, a reflex. The jukebox clicked into a slow track, a woman singing about coastal roads and second chances. The room seemed to loosen around them. They talked about nothing. He asked about sketches. She hadn't shown him yet. She asked about the road north, how long, what to pack. He said he had it covered. When she reached for her phone to text Lucille that she'd be gone for the weekend, Jason touched her wrist lightly. "You don't owe anyone an itinerary," he said, so gentle it landed like permission. She nodded and took another drink. The second sip ran hotter. The sweetness deepened, shading towards syrup. A small numbness skimmed the back of her tongue. She set the glass down. "That's strong." "House poor," he said, amused. "We can get you water if you want." "It's fine." She tried to find the line between cautious and fun and aimed at fun. The fan clicked overhead, a steady metronome. The river flashed under the windows. Jason told a story about getting stuck on a back road in a snowstorm and being rescued by a guy with a plow and a Labrador that wouldn't stop howling. He did voices, she laughed. The laugh felt a half-second late. She reached for the glass again, without thinking. The third swallow was colder, then warm in a way that moved too fast. Her head floated a fraction above her spine. She blinked, and the room pulled back a little, like a camera dollying away while keeping her face centered. "Slow down," Jason said, smiling as if he were teasing, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. "You're not trying to outdrink me, are you?" "Not a chance," she said. She meant it as lightness. The words missed their mark, came out softer than she'd intended. Heat gathered at the base of her skull. It spread in a thin sheet, reached her ears, slid behind her eyes. She took in a breath, and the breath came shorter than she expected. The bartender moved along the counter and left a thin, wet trail with a rag. The trail seemed to shine too brightly, as if the room had decided to highlight small things and neglect the rest. "Maybe water," she said. "On it." Jason rose and went to the bar. The world jogged when he stood, a gentle jump. She steadied her elbows on the table. Her phone had slid under her bag strap. When she reached for it, her fingers misjudged the distance and touched only wood. He returned with a glass of water, slid it toward her. "Here you go, champ." She took a mouthful. It tasted faintly metallic, like the air after lightning. He watched her drink. She registered it distantly, as if seeing herself from just outside her body. Girl in a corner booth, boy smiling, rain starting again beyond the window, the fan clicking, clicking, clicking. "Jason," she said, because his name seemed like a thing she should be able to hold. "What's in?" She meant the cocktail. The sentence took a turn and didn't arrive. "Citrus, bitters, a little something to smooth the edges," he said easily. "You're safe." That last word opened and shut like a door in her head. Safe. The music sounded far away now. The men at the bar were outlines. Jason's face had moved closer without crossing the distance. He touched her cheek, thumb gentle. "You look tired." "I am." The room tipped, a soft, slow pour. She gripped the table edge, and the wood felt both too smooth and too far from her hands. "Let's get you out of here," he said, voice calm. "Fresh air will help." He stood, lifted her bag, draped her jacket over his arm as if she'd asked him to. When she tried to rise, her knees offered suggestions instead of support. He slipped an arm around her waist. "Got you." The night air hit her and did nothing. The river was black glass. The parking lot lights made halos in the mist. He guided her toward the car, door already open, seat already angled back. She thought of the text she hadn't sent. She thought of Lucille standing by the window in a robe, hands wrapped around a mug. She tried to shape a word and got breath instead. "Sleep," Jason murmured, buckling her in. He kissed her forehead, the gesture practiced. "We'll be at the cabin before midnight." Cabin, she thought. A good word. It held quilts and quiet and the promise of waking up without alarms. As the car moved, streetlights stitched a pattern across the roof liner. Her stomach rolled once, angrily, then settled as if it, too, had been persuaded. City edges gave way to dark lanes. The hum of tires became part of her bloodstream. When she turned her head, the world lagged. Jason's profile was a cutout against the dash glow. He drove with both hands now, mouth set in a neutral line. She wanted to ask him to turn around. She wanted to say she'd changed her mind, that she wanted to go home and be small and safe in the house with the piano and the plate and the woman who had never once left her. But her lips were a fraction too slow for the thought. She slept, or something like it. Not a descent. More like someone drew blackout curtains across the inside of her skull. When she surfaced again, it wasn't morning. It was the sound of a door. Cold. The smell of wet wood. Her cheek against something rough. She turned, and the world didn't come with her. A rectangle of dark was open, then shut. Footsteps moved, thudded across planks. A latch settled. The quiet afterward wasn't the quiet of the river. It was the quiet of a place the world had forgotten. She reached for her phone and touched nothing. She sat up and her stomach pitched. The room spun once, then steadied into a shape she half recognized from stories. Cabin, single room, stove table. A window bent out of square, webbed with grime. Her shoes gone. Her bag gone. Her watch gone. The cold holding her like a wet sheet. Memory came back in pieces, sliding into position. Jason's hand on her knee. The coral drink. The word safe. The car. The turn north. The way the sky had disappeared into a lid of cloud. She stood, and the floor tilted beneath her, and then she was steady again because there was no other choice. On the table, a nail had rusted a perfect circle into the grain. Next to it, her sweater, his sweater. No, hers, only lighter now that the heat had stripped from it. She looked at the door and saw the new lock sunk into old wood, the bar scored with fresh tool marks, practical and recent. Her palm was empty. So was the space where a phone should have weighed her pocket. He had smiled while she drank. He had said she didn't owe anyone an itinerary. He had used her keys, her trust, her love as if they were all the same kind of tool. The realization didn't crash. It settled, hard as iron in her chest. He hadn't taken her to a getaway. He had delivered her to a holding place. And somewhere between here and home, he would take what he'd wanted from the beginning. The plate on Lucille's piano, the letters, the house, the woman who wouldn't resist much. Tessa gripped the edge of the table until her nails bit wood. In the corner, the stove gaped dull and cold. The nail above her temple throbbed, a metronome counting down. Everything he'd said had been a key, and she had handed him the door. Rain drummed against the canopy of pines, steady as breath. Somewhere beneath that gray rhythm, the forest held its own heartbeat, slow, patient, indifferent. When Peter Hall found her, he thought she was dead. He'd been patrolling the southern edge of Baxter State Park, scanning the ridgelines for downed trees after the storm. It was supposed to be a quick check before nightfall, but the beam of his flashlight caught something pale among the ferns a hand. Mud-streaked, fingers curled loosely, nails blue with cold. "Hey," he called, voice steady out of habit. "Hey there." No answer. He crouched beside her, brushed the wet hair from her face, and saw the shallow rise of her chest. Alive, barely. Her lips trembled with each breath. Her boots were soaked through. One was missing a lace. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, counted, and exhaled. "Jesus." He shrugged off his jacket, wrapped it around her, and lifted her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he expected, her head lolling against his shoulder. The nearest road was half a mile away. By the time he reached his truck, his arms burned and his knees ached, but she was still breathing. He laid her across the back seat, turned the heater on full, and drove toward his cabin, the only solid shelter within 15 miles. When Tessa woke again, it was to warmth. A fire crackled somewhere nearby, the sound sharp and irregular. She blinked at the ceiling, logs stacked in clean lines, a lantern hanging from a hook. A quilt covered her up to the shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar. She shifted, and pain came alive in her muscles. A deep, dull protest. The motion caught Peter's attention. He was sitting at a small table near the stove, radio in hand. "Easy," he said, standing. "You're safe. Found you out by the ridge." Her voice scraped when she tried to answer. "Where am I?" "My cabin," he said. "I called in an emergency to dispatch. Storm's got the line patchy, but they'll get a ranger unit out here soon." He poured water into a tin cup and knelt beside her. She drank greedily, the cold shocking her throat. When she finished, he looked her over again. "You been out there long?" "I don't know." He nodded, reading the truth in her face. His expression softened, a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You hurt anywhere?" "Just cold." He handed her another blanket. The firelight threw patterns across his face. Early 40s, maybe clean-cut but tired, the kind of man whose life had settled into solitude. "I'm Peter," he said. "You got a name?" "Tessa." She hesitated. "Tessa Morgan." "Well, Tessa Morgan, you picked a hell of a night to wander into the woods." Her lips parted. She wanted to laugh, but what came out was a trembling exhale. "I didn't wander." He raised an eyebrow. "Then what happened?" She looked at the flames for a long moment, the words fighting their way out. "Someone took me, locked me in a cabin. North of here, I think." Peter leaned forward. "You sure?" Her hands began to shake. "He drugged me. My boyfriend, Jason. I woke up there. I heard him. He sent people after my aunt. They were going to break into her house." The radio crackled. He turned it off. "That's a big accusation, Miss Morgan." "I know how it sounds," she whispered. "But it's true. He wanted something from her. A plate, silver, or platinum. I don't even know why." Peter studied her. There was dirt on her cheeks, blood on the sleeve of her sweater, fear buried in the whites of her eyes. "All right," he said finally. "I'll report it exactly as you said. You just stay put." He moved to the counter, picked up the radio again, and adjusted the dial. Base, this is Hull. I've got a female, mid-20s, found near Ridge 14. Says she was abducted, possibly drugged. Needs transport and medical. The response came through static. Copy that, Hull. Weather's closing in. Closest units, an hour out. Understood. He set the radio down and met her gaze. We'll get you to town as soon as it's safe. She nodded, but her body stayed tense. What if he comes back? Peter shook his head. He doesn't know you're here. I'll keep watch. He poured her a bowl of soup from the pot on the stove. The smell of potatoes and onions filled the room. When she tasted it, the warmth made her throat ache with relief. After a few minutes, he spoke again. You said you woke up in a cabin. Can you describe it? It was old, she said quietly. One window. A stove. They nailed the door shut from the outside. Two men. I heard them talking. Jason gave them orders. Peter frowned. You remember any names? She shook her head. Just his. The silence stretched, heavy with unasked questions. He didn't press further, but his eyes stayed thoughtful, part disbelief, part concern. He'd seen people panic before, spin stories from fear and exhaustion, but there was something too detailed about her account, too vivid to be delirium. When the soup was gone, he checked the time. Ambulance should be on its way once the road clears. Till then, try to rest. She tried, but every creak outside made her flinch. The storm had softened into drizzle, but the wind still prowled around the cabin, testing the roof and eaves. At one point, Peter rose, went to the window, and peered out with a flashlight. His silhouette against the glass looked steady, solid, a man accustomed to being the only barrier between the wild and what needed saving. He caught her watching. You're safe, he repeated. Nothing out there but trees. Tessa pulled the blanket tighter. Safe. The word felt fragile now, as if it could break under the weight of her thoughts. After what felt like hours, the radio finally hissed back to life. Hull, this is Ranger Station 1. We've got clearance for transport. Can you bring the subject to the road by East Trail? Peter answered, copy that. We'll head out. He turned to her. You think you can walk? She nodded. I have to. He packed the essentials, flashlight, first aid, thermos. Outside, the air was cold and damp, the world washed clean by rain. He helped her into the passenger seat of his truck, then climbed in beside her. The engine growled to life. As they drove, mist clung to the road, headlights cutting tunnels through it. The forest passed in ghostly silhouettes. Neither spoke for a while. Then Tessa's voice broke the silence, trembling but sure. Peter. Yeah. Please let her be safe. He didn't ask who she meant. The words hung between them, fragile as prayer, carried away by the hum of the engine and the rain hammering against the windshield as they headed toward Portland. And the truth waiting there, the rain had tapered into a soft drizzle by the time Peter's truck reached Portland. Dawn was only a rumor behind the clouds, turning the city into a blur of gray reflections and wet pavement. The wipers whispered across the windshield as they turned onto Lucille Street, a narrow lane lined with aging maples and houses that still held their porch lights on, as if trying to keep the night away. Tessa leaned forward in her seat, heart pounding hard enough to shake her ribs. The closer they got, the more her breath came in shallow bursts. She could see it even before Peter stopped the truck, the red and blue strobes flashing off wet siding, the silhouettes of officers moving through the yard, and the yellow tape cutting across the front steps like a wound. Her hand went numb around the door handle. Oh, God! Peter put a steadying hand on her shoulder. Let me talk to them first. But she was already out of the truck before he could finish, boots splashing through puddles, her voice breaking as she shouted, Lucille! Where is she? A uniformed officer stepped in her path. Ma'am, you can't. That's my house, she cried, breath hitching. My aunt, she's inside. Recognition flashed in the officer's eyes as another voice cut in behind him. Morgan? You're Tessa Morgan. The speaker was Detective Harris, a man in his 50s with the kind of face that looked carved from skepticism. He nodded at Peter, then turned to her. She's alive. Paramedics are with her now. We found her unconscious when we arrived. Tessa's knees gave a little. Alive! The word came out like a prayer, half disbelieving. Harris nodded again, guiding her toward the porch. Looks like someone broke in through the back door. House is torn apart, but she's breathing. She'll need a hospital check, though. The smell hit her as soon as they stepped inside. Overturned earth from broken plants, spilled liquor, and something metallic that made her stomach twist. Drawers had been emptied onto the floor. Picture frames smashed, the piano lid forced open. The silver plate that had gleamed there since Tessa was a child was gone. Lucille lay on the couch under a blanket, her skin pale against the dark fabric, a paramedic checking her pulse. She'll be okay, the medic murmured. Shock and a nasty bruise, but she'll recover. Tessa dropped beside her, clutching her aunt's hand. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I should have listened. Lucille's eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. The faint squeeze of her fingers was enough to draw tears down Tessa's face. Detective Harris waited until she could breathe again before speaking. We found prints all over the place. One belongs to Jason Hall. Ring any bells? Her head snapped up. Jason Hall. Your boyfriend. His tone was flat, already knowing the answer. Not anymore. Her voice cracked on the last word. Peter, standing by the door, crossed his arms. You'll want to get her to a hospital, detective. She's been through hell. Harris nodded, motioning to a younger officer. Take them both in. We'll have an ambulance. Meet them halfway. At the hospital, fluorescent lights painted everything too white. The warmth that should have meant safety only made Tessa feel exposed. Nurses spoke softly, efficiently, for vitals, temperature. When the doctor said she'd been drugged with a mild sedative mixed with alcohol, Tessa barely reacted. The information slid across her mind like rain over glass. A social worker asked questions. So did the police. She answered them all, voice calm, detached, the story unfolding piece by piece. The drink, the cabin, the men, the escape, the rescue. Every time she said Jason's name, something in her chest turned to stone. Detective Harris came by later with news. We've got him, he said, dropping a folder onto the table beside her bed. Picked him up outside Augusta about 2 hours ago. Tried to pawn some antiques to a dealer who thought they looked too clean. One of them matched a description from your aunt's inventory. Tessa stared at the folder without opening it. He didn't even get far. No, Harris said, but he would have if you hadn't made it out. That night, when Lucille was transferred to the same hospital, Tessa sat by her bedside. The older woman was awake but weak, her voice no more than a whisper. You came back. I never should have left, Tessa said, tears sliding down her cheeks. Lucille's eyes softened. We all leave when we think love will save us. The trick is knowing when it won't. 2 days later, the Portland Police Department brought her in to give a final statement. Jason was already in custody. The interrogation room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a sterile cage of gray walls and bad lighting. They let her watch from the other side of the one-way glass. He looked smaller than she remembered, sitting there in his cuffed wrists and prison-issued sweatshirt. But the smirk was still there, that easy, practiced charm, stripped of context. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the detective who questioned him. When Harris asked why he did it, Jason laughed softly. You think I'm stupid enough to answer that without a lawyer. But there was a glint in his gaze that wasn't defiance, it was satisfaction. As if part of him still believed he'd won something. Harris pressed. You drugged her, Jason. You set 2 men on her family. You nearly killed an old woman for a piece of metal. What was it worth to you? Jason shrugged. Enough to try. From behind the glass, Tessa's reflection hovered over his image. Pale, worn, unrecognizable. She stepped closer, watching the man who had once kissed her forehead and promised her forever. For a brief moment, Jason looked up. Their eyes met through the mirror's illusion, and the smirk faltered. Just a flicker, but it was enough. When the session ended, Harris turned to her. You sure you're up for this? I need to be, she said. They led her into the room. Jason's gaze shifted, calculating, but she met it steadily. The silence between them stretched, sharp as glass. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and even. You took everything from me, Jason, but you'll never touch my peace again. He smiled, a weak, bitter curve. That's so. She didn't flinch. That's so. The officer signaled for him to be taken away. Chains clinked. The door closed behind him with a final, heavy sound. Tessa exhaled, long and steady, like someone who had been holding her breath for years. The sound of it filled the empty room. For the first time since the night of the river bar, the air around her didn't feel borrowed. It felt like hers again. A month passed before the house on Elmwood Lane began to feel alive again. The yellow police tape was gone, the broken glass replaced, and the piano, its lid once pried open by strangers, sat closed beneath a vase of fresh lilies. The scent drifted through the rooms, soft and clean, like the first breath after a storm. Lucille had recovered faster than the doctors expected. There was still a faint bruise near her temple, a reminder of the night chaos found their quiet street, but her eyes had regained their calm brightness. She moved slowly now, cane in hand, but her voice was strong enough to fill the kitchen again when she hummed while brewing tea. Tessa lived there with her, sleeping in her old room under the eaves, surrounded by the same wallpaper she had once begged to paint over. Some mornings she woke before dawn and lay listening to the tick of the old clock in the hall, the soft creak of Lucille's footsteps, the wind moving through the maples outside. It was a fragile kind of peace, but it was real. Her days were divided into small acts of rebuilding. Therapy twice a week at the community clinic downtown. Walks through the park when the air was clear. Calls from Detective Harris updating her on the legal proceedings she no longer needed to attend. The nightmares still came sometimes, dark rooms, locked doors, the sound of Jason's voice whispering her name, but they no longer owned her. Peter visited most weekends. He never stayed long, just enough time to check the gutters or repair the warped boards on the porch. He'd bring coffee in a thermos and a half-smile that always seemed to belong more to the forest than the city. The first time he came after her therapy session, she'd been weeding the garden, her hands buried in damp soil. You missed a spot, he said, kneeling beside her without waiting for an invitation. She glanced up, shading her eyes from the sun. You're a ranger, not a gardener. Same principle, he replied. Patience and observation. They worked quietly after that, pulling weeds, restoring neatness to the small patch of earth Lucille loved so much. When they finished, Tessa looked at her hands, streaked with dirt but steady. I used to hate this garden, she said softly. It always felt like something Lucille wanted me to care about, not something I actually did. Peter brushed the soil from his palms. Maybe it just needed to become yours, too. There was no rush between them, no sudden confession or cinematic pull. What grew instead was a quiet understanding. Two people connected not by tragedy but by survival. Sometimes they talked about ordinary things, weather, wildlife, the best kind of wood for a porch railing. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, and that silence felt like kindness. Lucille watched them with a knowing patience. She never teased, never pushed. Instead, she offered small encouragements disguised as errands. Peter, you're taller. Can you check the light fixture on the landing? Or, Tessa, dear, show him that old camera in the attic, the one that doesn't quite work. By mid-April, the rhythm of the house had settled into something that felt like home. Lucille's choir students had started visiting again, filling the rooms with off-key laughter and the soft shuffle of sheet music. The sound no longer startled Tessa, it made her smile. One Sunday morning, the air carried that rare stillness Maine sometimes gifted before spring finally surrendered to summer. Sunlight spilled through the lace curtains, warming the kitchen tiles. Lucille stood by the stove, humming, the kettle already beginning to sing. Tessa sat at the table with a notebook open beside her cup of tea, trying to put words to the last year. Therapy exercises, her counselor called them. Peter knocked softly at the back door before stepping in. He carried a wooden crate of seedlings and a shy grin. For the garden. Thought we could try again. Lucille turned, eyes crinkling. You'll stay for breakfast, won't you? Only if there's enough tea, he said, glancing at the kettle. There's always enough tea, she replied. They ate together, sunlight pooling across the table, conversation easy and unhurried. At one point, Lucille reached over, squeezed Tessa's hand, and said quietly, "Life gives us second chances, if we have the courage to take them." Tessa met her gaze and smiled. "I think I finally did." Later, when Peter went out to plant the seedlings, she joined him in the yard. The air smelled of wet soil and lilac, the same scent that had clung to her childhood summers. She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers into the ground, feeling its cool pulse. For a long moment, she simply breathed, in and out, matching the rhythm of the earth. No flashbacks, no fear, just the simple, grounding truth of being here, now alive. The house behind them glowed gold in the morning light. Lucille's voice drifted through the open window, soft and steady, humming an old melody Tessa had loved as a child. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Tessa realized the song didn't make her ache anymore. It made her believe. A year passed like a tide receding, quietly, persistently, taking with it the sharp edges of everything that had once felt unbearable. Portland had thawed into another spring, and with it came the night that marked a new beginning. The Portland Performing Arts Center shimmered under soft rain and lamplight. Inside, the air was alive with anticipation, programs rustling, voices hushed into reverence. The banners above the stage read "A Night for Hope," a charity concert by Lucille Morgan. Tessa sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Around her, the theater glowed in warm gold tones, the chandeliers reflecting hundreds of tiny suns. The same stage where her aunt had once stood decades ago now waited in silence, instruments gleaming under the lights. When Lucille stepped out, the audience rose to their feet. She moved with the grace of someone who had learned to carry both fragility and strength in equal measure. Time had silvered her hair and softened her posture, but her presence commanded the room. She paused at center stage, microphone in hand, and when she smiled, it wasn't just for the crowd, it was for the woman sitting in the front row. Tessa felt tears rise before the first note even began. The orchestra started softly, a low hum of strings, a piano threading through like breath. Then Lucille sang. Her voice, though aged, carried a richness that silence itself seemed to lean toward. It wasn't the flawless voice she'd had in her youth, but something truer, tempered by heartbreak rebuilt from pain. Every note carried memory. The night of the storm, the breaking glass, the forgiveness that had taken root in the soil of survival. Tessa closed her eyes and let it move through her. The melody reached deep, to the places where fear had once lived, where Jason's voice still echoed in her dreams. But the music didn't open those wounds, it sealed them. In her mind's eye, the past played out like faint light flickering on a film reel. The cabin appeared again, but softer now, the dark corners washed in pale gold. Rain whispered against the broken window. The forest shimmered under dawn's mist. She saw herself stumbling through that world of danger and confusion, and for the first time, she didn't feel trapped inside it. She was watching from a distance, outside the frame. The girl in that memory wasn't her anymore. The song built toward its bridge, a slow crescendo that filled the hall like sunrise. The orchestra swelled, and Lucille lifted her gaze from the sheet in front of her, looking down at the audience, at Tessa. Their eyes met, and for a suspended moment the noise fell away. Lucille's smile was small but certain, her eyes carrying the language of everything that had never needed to be said aloud. Forgiveness, pride, love. Tessa felt a hit her all at once, a quiet, radiant peace that expanded through her chest until it hurt to contain. The tears she'd held back finally fell, not from grief, but from gratitude. When the final note lingered, it seemed to hang in the air longer than possible, refusing to fade. The audience remained still, as if breathing might break it. Then came the applause, thunderous, alive, rising like waves against the stage. Lucille bowed once, twice, then placed a hand over her heart and nodded toward Tessa. The crowd didn't know the full story, but Tessa did. This wasn't just a concert. It was a reclamation of life, of voice, of legacy. Afterward, backstage, the hum of celebration filled the narrow corridors. Flowers crowded every surface, scenting the air with lilies and roses. Lucille sat in a small dressing room, a blanket around her shoulders, a cup of honey tea in her hand. Tessa entered quietly. "You were perfect," she said, her voice soft. Lucille laughed, a sound warm as sunlight through leaves. "Perfect is for records. Tonight was real." Tessa knelt beside her, took her hand. "I think Mom would have been proud." "I think," Lucille replied, squeezing her fingers gently. She finally found her peace too. They sat together in silence, listening to the muffled applause still echoing from beyond the curtain. Peter arrived a moment later, smelling faintly of rain and pine. He handed Lucille a bouquet of wildflowers he must have picked himself. "Figured the fancy ones didn't stand a chance next to these," he said with a grin. Lucille chuckled, accepting them. "You always did have good instincts." Peter looked at Tessa, and their eyes met in the easy way of people who no longer needed to explain the road they'd taken. "You heading home soon?" "In a bit," she said. "I want to walk. The city's beautiful after the rain." He nodded. "I'll drive behind you just in case." When she finally stepped out of the hall, the night was cool and silver. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glimmered with its memory. The neon reflections on the pavement looked almost like brushstrokes, soft pinks, blues, and golds blending into one another. Tessa walked slowly, the sound of Lucille's final song still echoing in her chest. Around her, the city carried on, taxis gliding by, laughter spilling from a distant cafe, the world spinning forward without noticing her quiet rebirth. She paused under a streetlight, tilted her face to the sky, and closed her eyes. The air smelled of wet stone and possibility. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the last remnants of the past dissolve. The cabin, the fear, the voice that once told her she'd never be enough. All of it slipping away like fog under morning sun. Her life had begun again in the same place it had nearly ended. Not in some grand act of revenge, but in a simple, silent reclamation of peace. And as she stood there, light cascading over her, the words formed in her mind like a whisper carried by the wind. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find the one thing that was always ours, love. She smiled, a slow, steady curve that felt like sunrise. Inside the concert hall behind her, a piano began to play, soft, deliberate notes echoing into the golden night, as if the music itself were blessing the silence that followed. "Fade out,"